The asparagus was perfect, fresh, tender, precisely cooked, the kind of vegetable that most Germans hadn't seen in years as war rations grew increasingly meager. Bell peppers, exotic fruits, the finest rice and pasta accompanied every meal. It was food fit for a king, prepared by expert chefs using ingredients sourced from across occupied Europe. But 25-year-old Margot Wölk couldn't enjoy a single bite. Every forkful might be her last. Every swallow could mean death. She sat at a wooden table in a barracks near Hitler's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, one of 15 young women forced to taste the Führer's food before it was served to him. The year was 1942, and for the next 2.5 years, Margot would live with the constant terror that the British would finally succeed in poisoning Adolf Hitler, and that she would die first, the canary in the coal mine, the human shield between assassination and the man who had plunged the world into catastrophic war. Every day we feared it was going to be our last meal, Margot would recall 70 years later, finally breaking a silence she had maintained even from her husband. This is the story of Hitler's food taster, an ordinary German woman conscripted into one of the war's strangest and most terrifying roles, who survived when all her companions did not, who kept her secret for 7 decades, and who finally, at age 95, revealed what it meant to eat fear daily in service to history's most evil man. Margot Wölk was born on December 27, 1917, in Wilmersdorf, a middle-class district of Berlin. She grew up in the same apartment where she would live her entire life, a modest Berlin flat that would witness the entire arc of 20th-century German history: the Weimar Republic's chaos, the Nazi rise to power, wartime destruction, Soviet occupation, Cold War division, reunification, and finally the quiet decline of old age. The Wölk family was not Nazi. Despite intense social pressure and the professional consequences of refusal, Margot's father declined to join the Nazi Party, enduring ridicule and ostracism for his choice. Margot herself refused to join the Bund Deutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls that was the female branch of Hitler Youth. This defiance in a totalitarian state required courage, but it also created records, made the Wölks known to local Nazi officials as unreliable, as people who needed watching. That would matter later. In 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, Margot married Karl Wölk in a rushed ceremony before he was deployed with the Wehrmacht. She was 21, beginning adult life in a Germany that was about to consume Europe in flames. Karl went to war. Margot stayed in Berlin, working as a secretary, living in her family's apartment, trying to maintain normalcy as the world around her disintegrated. Then came the bombing. The Royal Air Force began targeting Berlin in 1940, and the raids intensified throughout 1941 and 1942. The building where Margot lived was damaged, the roof partially destroyed, water flooding the rooms. Berlin was becoming uninhabitable, particularly for civilians without critical war work. Margot made the decision that millions of Germans made during those years. She evacuated to the countryside, seeking refuge with relatives far from the targeted cities. In the winter of 1941, Margot traveled 700 kilometers east to Grossparts, a tiny village in East Prussia where her husband's parents lived in a house with a large garden. It seemed like safety, like escape from the war. She had no idea that she was moving to within 3 kilometers of the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's primary Eastern Front military headquarters in East Prussia. The complex had been built in 1940-1941 in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hidden in dense Masurian forest, protected by minefields and multiple security perimeters, the Wolf's Lair was where Hitler spent much of 1941 to 1944, directing the war in the East. It was a city unto itself. Bunkers and barracks, conference rooms and communication centers, hundreds of personnel managing the logistics of genocide and military conquest. And starting in 1942, it needed food tasters. Hitler's paranoia about assassination was well-founded. Multiple attempts had already been made on his life, and rumors swirled constantly about plots to poison him. The British, the Soviets, the German resistance, any of them might try to kill the Führer through his food. Hitler had become extremely particular about what he ate. He was a vegetarian, having given up meat in the 1930s, claiming it caused him digestive distress and that vegetarianism improved his health. No meat or fish ever appeared on his table. This dietary restriction actually heightened security concerns because it meant Hitler's meals were distinctive, identifiable, targetable. Everyone knew the Führer ate only vegetables, grains, and fruits. An assassin attempting to poison the general food supply at the Wolf's Lair might fail to reach Hitler, but someone targeting the special vegetarian meals could succeed. In 1942, Hitler's security detail decided systematic testing was necessary. They needed food tasters, and not just one or two. They needed enough to make the sample size statistically meaningful, enough that if poison were present, it would almost certainly affect at least one taster before it reached the Führer. 15 young women seemed appropriate. The local mayor of Grosse Parts and surrounding villages received orders to select candidates. The criteria were specific: young, healthy women who could be watched constantly and who had no obvious connections that might make them security risks. Margot Wölk, the newcomer from Berlin with a record of refusing to join Nazi organizations, was conscripted. It was both punishment for her family's lack of enthusiasm for the regime and exploitation of her vulnerable position as an evacuee without local connections. One morning in 1942, Margot heard shouting beneath her bedroom window. "Margot, get up!" SS officers had come to collect her. She and 15 other young women, all in their 20s, all selected without consultation or consent, were taken by bus to Krausendorf, a nearby village where Hitler's meals were prepared in a 2-story building. This would be their workplace for the next 2.5 years. The routine was rigid and unvarying. 5 days a week, the women were collected by bus and brought to the testing facility. They arrived between 11 a.m. and noon, the time when Hitler typically took his midday meal. The food would already be prepared, arranged on large plates around a wooden table. The women sat on wooden benches and waited. Then the eating began. The food was delicious, only the best vegetables, asparagus, bell peppers, everything you can imagine, Margot recalled decades later. And always with a side of rice or pasta. In a Germany where ordinary citizens survived on increasingly meager rations, ersatz coffee, turnips, black bread, the food tasters ate like royalty. Exotic fruits that hadn't been seen in German shops for years appeared on their plates. Fresh vegetables, perfectly prepared, complex dishes with multiple components. Everything was vegetarian, of course, but within that constraint, the variety was extraordinary. Hitler's chefs had access to supplies from across occupied Europe. Nothing was too good for the Führer, and by extension, nothing was too good for the women who ensured his safety. But the women couldn't enjoy it. This constant fear, we knew of all those poisoning rumors and could never enjoy the food, Margot explained. Every day we feared it was going to be our last meal. They ate in silence, watching each other, waiting to see if anyone would show symptoms. The meals typically lasted about an hour. The women ate, then sat, then waited while SS officers monitored them. If after an hour no one had shown signs of poisoning, nausea, dizziness, convulsions, death, the food was declared safe. The same meals that had been tasted were then packed into crates and transported to the main Wolf's Lair complex, where Hitler would eat them, confident that he faced no danger from British or Soviet assassins with access to his kitchen. The psychological torture of this routine was profound. Imagine sitting down to a beautiful meal and knowing it might kill you.
Not might kill you in the abstract way that all food carries some risk, but might kill you because someone powerful and organized is actively trying to murder the man whose food you're eating. The women knew about the assassination plots. Everyone at the Wolf's Lair knew. Security was the entire purpose of the facility. They knew the British wanted Hitler dead. They knew the Soviets wanted Hitler dead. They knew that Germans themselves, German officers and resistance fighters wanted Hitler dead. And they knew that poison was a favored method because it could be introduced anywhere along the supply chain, from farm to kitchen to table. Every meal was a test of nerve, every bite an act of courage or desperation, depending on your perspective. The women bonded through shared trauma. Margot later described them as nice girls, young women like herself who had been conscripted into this nightmare through no choice of their own. They tried to maintain morale, tried to pretend they were just doing ordinary work. Some developed relationships with the SS officers who guarded them. These were complicated relationships. Their guards were also their captors, the men who shouted them awake in the morning and monitored them during meals. Some relationships were exploitative and coercive. Others were genuinely affectionate, young people finding connection in the midst of war. Margot herself made friends among the officers, relationships that would later save her life. She never saw Hitler himself during her entire 2.5 years at the Wolf's Lair. She saw his German shepherd, Blondie, who often played in the open area near the food tasters' barracks. She saw SS guards and military officers. She saw the massive security apparatus that protected the Führer. But Hitler himself remained a distant figure, a man whose food she ate, but whose face she never saw. This distance made the whole experience surreal. She was intimately connected to Hitler, literally ingesting his food before he did, yet he was an abstraction, a figure glimpsed only through his dietary preferences and his security paranoia. On July 20th, 1944, the women were sitting at their usual wooden benches when the building shook violently. "We heard and felt an incredible big bang," Margot recalled. "We fell off the benches and I heard someone shouting, 'Hitler is dead.'" It was the Stauffenberg assassination attempt, the bomb planted in the conference room at the Wolf's Lair. For a few minutes, the food tasters and everyone else believed the Führer had finally been killed. But then word came. Hitler had survived. The bomb had killed 4 men and wounded 20 others, but Hitler himself had escaped with minor injuries. The assassination had failed. The consequences were immediate and severe. Thousands would be executed in the following months as the Nazi regime hunted down everyone connected to the plot. For the food tasters, the failed assassination brought increased security and increased paranoia. Margot was ordered to move out of her in-laws' house and into an abandoned school building closer to the Wolf's Lair compound. The women were now under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their lives even more controlled than before. The SS was taking no chances after coming so close to losing their Führer. The war was also going badly for Germany by late 1944. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces had broken out of Normandy and were pushing toward Germany from the west. The Wolf's Lair, once deep in secure German territory, was now potentially in the path of advancing Soviet armies. In autumn 1944, a German lieutenant who had befriended Margot took her aside. The Soviets were only a few kilometers away, he told her. When they reached the Wolf's Lair, they would take revenge on everyone connected to Hitler's headquarters. The food tasters would be targets. She needed to leave immediately. Margot packed her suitcase and went to the train station, fleeing without official permission, without papers authorizing her departure. She was technically deserting, and if the SS found her, she could be arrested or executed. But she took the risk. The train carried her back to Berlin, back to the bombed apartment where she had grown up, back to a city facing complete destruction.
Margot went into hiding in Berlin, avoiding SS patrols that might discover she had abandoned her post. Meanwhile, at the Wolf's Lair, the other 14 food tasters remained. Their families were local. They had nowhere else to go. In January 1945, Soviet forces overran the Wolf's Lair as German forces retreated west. Hitler had already abandoned the complex, returning to Berlin for the final stand. The food tasters left behind were discovered by Soviet troops. According to the testimony Margot received later, all 14 were executed, shot by Soviet soldiers who saw them as collaborators with the Nazi regime. They had tasted Hitler's food for years. That was enough to condemn them. Margot was the only survivor of the 15, saved by her decision to flee and by the lieutenant who had warned her to run. But survival came at a terrible price. When Soviet forces took Berlin in April-May 1945, they captured Margot. They took me to a doctor's apartment and raped me for 14 consecutive days, she said 7 decades later. The man who did it called himself Major Berlin. The trauma was not just psychological. After that, I was very ill. I could never have children. They destroyed everything. The Soviet occupation of Berlin brought violence to countless German women, but knowing the statistics doesn't make individual suffering less real. Margot's body bore permanent scars from those 2 weeks. She would never have the children she might have wanted. The war had taken from her in ways that continued long after the fighting stopped. Her husband Karl returned from the war. They rebuilt their lives as best they could. Margot worked various jobs, mostly as a secretary or administrative assistant, the skills she'd learned before the war, still useful in post-war Germany. She and Karl never discussed her time as Hitler's food taster. She never told him. She kept the secret buried, locked away because of shame and fear. Shame because she had worked for the Nazi regime, however unwillingly. Fear because in post-war Germany, anyone connected to Nazi crimes faced potential prosecution. Margot hadn't committed war crimes, hadn't hurt anyone, had been forced into her role. But how could she prove that? How could she explain her association with Hitler without being judged, condemned, perhaps prosecuted? So she said nothing. For 50 years, she maintained absolute silence about her wartime experiences. Karl died in 1990. Margot continued living in the same Berlin apartment, the same flat where she'd been born in 1917. The years accumulated. Germany reunified. The Berlin Wall came down. The world changed dramatically, but Margot remained in her apartment, aging quietly, carrying her secret. By her 90s, she had not left the apartment in 8 years. The building had no elevator, and she was too frail to manage the stairs. Nurses visited several times daily. A niece stopped by regularly. Margot had become a recluse, confined to the space where she'd lived her entire life, surrounded by memories she couldn't share. Then, in December 2012, a few months after her 95th birthday, Margot decided to break her silence. She gave an interview to a local Berlin journalist revealing for the first time that she had been one of Hitler's food tasters. The story exploded internationally. The Associated Press, BBC, CBC, news organizations around the world picked up the story. Here was a living witness to one of history's strangest footnotes, the last survivor of the food tasters finally willing to talk after 70 years. The response was overwhelming. School teachers wrote asking for photographs and autographs to bring history alive for students. Museum researchers visited to document her testimony. Publishers contacted her about writing a memoir. Margot gave multiple interviews in 2013, describing her experiences in detail. She spoke about the fear, the food, the other women, the final flight from the Wolf's Lair. She clarified that she had never been a Nazi Party member, that her family had resisted Nazi ideology, that she had been forced into her role. She wanted people to understand that she had been a victim too, trapped by circumstances beyond her control, conscripted into service she never sought. For decades, I tried to shake off those memories, but they always came back to haunt me at night. Speaking publicly was her attempt to purge the trauma, to finally share the burden she'd carried alone for so long. The revelation of her story raised complicated questions about guilt, complicity, and victimhood. Margot insisted she had no choice, that refusing would have meant execution. This was likely true. By 1942, the Nazi regime did not tolerate defiance. Women who refused orders could be sent to concentration camps or simply shot. Margot's survival depended on compliance. Yet she had, however unwillingly, served Hitler's security apparatus. She had helped keep him alive. If she had refused and been executed, or if she had somehow poisoned the food herself, Hitler might have died years earlier. Would that have shortened the war? Saved lives? The counterfactuals are impossible to answer, but they haunted discussions of Margot's story. Some critics argued she should have sacrificed herself by poisoning a meal, accepting death to kill Hitler. Margot herself addressed this, saying she lacked access to poison and was constantly monitored. How could a 25-year-old secretary with no training and no access to toxic substances poison meals that were prepared by Hitler's own chefs? It was a fantasy to imagine she could have done it. Others were more sympathetic, recognizing that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances often have no good choices. Margot was conscripted, threatened, monitored constantly. She did what she needed to do to survive. Condemning her for not being a hero seemed cruel when she was clearly a victim. Margot Wölk died in April 2014, aged 96, about a year after her story became public. She spent her final months giving interviews, sharing her story, trying to ensure that this bizarre chapter of history would be remembered. 2 novels were later written based on her experiences. At the Wolf's Table by Italian author Rossella Pastorino and The Taster by V.S. Alexander. Both are fictionalized accounts that take Margot's testimony as a starting point and imagine the inner lives and relationships of the food tasters. A 2024 film adaptation of Pastorino's novel brought the story to even wider audiences. Some historians have questioned aspects of Margot's account. Sven Felix Kellerhoff, a German historian, noted that Hitler had digestive problems in his final years and hired a personal dietitian who prepared separate meals in a different kitchen. If true, this suggests the food tasters might not have been tasting food Hitler actually ate. But other historians note that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The Wolf's Lair's daily operations were not extensively documented, especially regarding mundane matters like food preparation. Margot's testimony remains the only first-hand account of food tasting operations, and while it cannot be independently verified in all details, neither can it be definitively disproven. What is certain is that Margot Wölk's story reveals something important about World War II beyond the great battles and famous leaders. It shows how ordinary people were pulled into the Nazi system, often against their will, often in roles that seemed bizarre or trivial in retrospect, but were deadly serious at the time. Margot was not a concentration camp guard or a Gestapo officer. She was a secretary who fled Berlin to escape bombing and ended up eating Hitler's vegetables. Yet her experience was shaped by the same totalitarian system that perpetrated genocide. She lost her ability to have children to Soviet violence that was itself a consequence of Nazi aggression. She lived with trauma and shame for 70 years because of a role she never chose and could not refuse. The story of Hitler's food tasters also reveals the Führer's paranoia and the elaborate security apparatus built around him. Hitler lived in constant fear of assassination, and that fear was justified. Multiple plots targeted him throughout the war. The food tasters were just one layer of security among many, but they were a uniquely intimate layer. These women put Hitler's food in their mouths before he did. They were his human shields, the canaries in his coal mine. That 15 young women were deemed necessary, that the risk of assassination through poisoning was taken so seriously, says something about how many enemies Hitler had and how vulnerable he knew himself to be despite all his power. Today, if you visit the ruins of the Wolf's Lair, you can walk among the destroyed bunkers and imagine what life was like there. The concrete structures still stand, massive and imposing even in ruins. The forest has reclaimed much of the complex. It's a strange, quiet place, haunted by history. Somewhere in those ruins, 15 young women once sat at wooden benches and ate perfect asparagus with trembling hands, not knowing if they would survive the meal. 14 of them didn't survive the war. One did, and 70 decades later, she told the world what it meant to eat Hitler's food, to serve evil through simple acts of eating, to survive when others did not, and to carry that survival as a burden for the rest of a very long life.